In Tokyo's gleaming martial arts exhibition, a viral black belt sensation was about to turn tradition into mockery. A celebration of skill turned deadly serious when an arrogant influencer called out a living legend on stage. Darius, the Dragon. Kent wasn't your typical exhibition fighter. For nearly a decade, he was a 5 million follower martial arts phenom, known for his Dragon Blitz combo and flashy viral-ready takedowns. When Darius mocked Steven Seagal, calling him just movies and memes, he had no idea he was baiting a 6-time undefeated world karate champion. Seagal accepted the challenge with quiet resolve, unleashing clinical precision that would dismantle Darius's ego and ignite a global conversation. What began as a cocky publicity stunt would become a public humbling. The Tokyo Martial Arts Exhibition would never be the same after the legend stepped forward, not to fight, but to teach. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Tokyo Martial Arts Exhibition erupted with sensory assault, pounding electronic music, flashing LED screens, and the roar of thousands beneath pulsing lights. The central arena gleamed like a temple of modern combat, bordered by massive sponsor logos and enormous screens displaying fighter stats in real time. This wasn't just a martial arts exhibition. It was entertainment engineered for the digital age, where tradition met technology in a spectacular collision of old and new. Darius, the Dragon, Kent felt the energy like electricity in his veins as he circled the demonstration mat, his black belt tied tight around his waist, arms spread wide to absorb the crowd's adoration. At 28, he had built an empire on the perfect combination of legitimate skill and calculated showmanship. 5 million followers across platforms, sponsorship deals with energy drinks and athletic wear, and a signature move, the Dragon Blitz, that had been turned into viral reaction gifs and TikTok dance challenges. Let's hear it for our exhibition champion. The announcer's voice boomed through the arena as Darius's latest opponent stumbled off the mat, assisted by medical staff. The man had been decent, a regional champion with solid fundamentals. But Darius had dismantled him with flashy combinations designed more for cameras than combat effectiveness. Darius grabbed the wireless mic, his breathing barely elevated despite the 3-minute exhibition match. "Another one down," he shouted, spinning to make sure every section of the crowd got a good view for their videos. His movements were theatrical, each gesture calculated for maximum visual impact. Who's next? Anyone think they can step to the Dragon? In the VIP section, separated from general admission by a velvet rope and elevated platform, sat Steven Seagal. At 72, his presence was still commanding, his posture straight, his gaze steady beneath the iconic brow that had launched 1,000 internet memes. He wore a simple black button-up shirt, his championship rings the only visible testament to his competitive past. He'd accepted the invitation to be an honorary guest primarily to support the young athletes competing in the traditional divisions. Later that day, Seagal watched Darius with quiet assessment, neither impressed nor dismissive, simply observing with the patient eyes of someone who had seen martial arts evolve across 6 decades. Beside him sat Marcus "Brick" Delgado, his former student and now constant companion at public events. Built like his nickname suggested, Brick kept a protective but respectful distance, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to honor Seagal's independence. "That kid's got some legitimate skill underneath all that trash talk," Seagal noted quietly to Brick, his voice barely audible above the arena noise. Brick nodded, his eyes never leaving Darius. "Shame he's wasting it showing off." In the commentary booth overlooking the arena, Amelia Thompson adjusted her headset, her quick eyes taking in every detail. At 42, the former Taekwondo world champion had pivoted to becoming one of martial arts' most respected commentators, bringing both technical knowledge and emotional intelligence to her analysis. "We're witnessing quite the spectacle with Darius Kent," she said into her microphone, her voice carrying to viewers streaming the event worldwide. "His technical foundation is undeniable. That spinning hook kick was textbook, but I'm not sure his current approach honors the deeper aspects of martial arts tradition." Down on the mat, Darius continued his victory lap, high-fiving fans. In the front row, signing autographs on phones thrust toward him, His smile was practiced, his energy infectious, but there was something hollow beneath the surface, a performer playing a role rather than a martial artist expressing his art. All right, he called out, returning to center stage. Since no one here wants to challenge me. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the anticipation build. Maybe I should call out someone special. The crowd noise shifted from general excitement to focused anticipation. Phones lifted higher, sensing something memorable was about to happen. Darius turned slowly, theatrically, his eyes scanning the VIP section until they locked onto Steven Seagal. His grin widened, eyes glinting with the calculated look of someone who knew exactly how viral this moment could become. I see we have a special guest today, Darius said, pointing directly at Seagal. The man, the myth, the meme, Steven Seagal himself. The crowd's reaction was mixed, surprised laughter, a few gasps, several phones immediately pivoting to capture Seagal's reaction. On the big screens, Seagal's face appeared calm and impassive as Darius continued his performance. You know, kids these days, they don't know Steven as a fighter. Darius bounced on his toes, playing to the cameras. They know him as an internet joke. Steven Seagal facts, right? Steven Seagal doesn't do push-ups, he pushes the earth down. He mimicked an exaggerated push-up, drawing scattered laughter from the younger sections of the crowd. In the booth, Amelia tensed visibly. This is unexpected, she said carefully. For those unaware of Steven Seagal's actual accomplishments before his film career, he was a 6-time undefeated world karate champion in the middleweight division. His competitive record was extraordinary. On the floor, Darius was warming to his theme, feeding off the crowd's energy like a vampire drawing blood. I respect the classics, man, I really do. But that was what, 50, 60 years ago? Before most of us were born. He gestured to the predominantly young crowd. Today's martial arts has evolved. It's faster, stronger, more dynamic. More like what I do. He threw a flashy combination into the air, complete with an unnecessary but visually impressive flip that had the crowd cheering again. When he landed, he struck a pose that photographers would capture from dozens of angles. Brick shifted in, his seat, his massive frame tensing. Sir, he began, but Seagal lifted a hand slightly, stopping him. It's fine, Seagal said quietly, his eyes never leaving Darius. So what do you say, Mr. Seagal? Darius called out, his voice echoing through the arena with the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. Care to step in for a friendly round? Show these kids what the old school can do. Or is it all just movies and memes these days? The crowd erupted, some cheering the audacity, others murmuring in discomfort at the blatant disrespect. The challenge hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Seagal remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, seemingly unbothered by the provocation that would have sent lesser men into rage. There's a tension in the arena that wasn't here a moment ago, Amelia observed from the booth, her voice dropping slightly. What we're witnessing isn't just generational, it's philosophical. Darius represents the performative aspect of martial arts, while Steven Seagal has always embodied its deeper principles. The arena fell into an expectant hush, thousands of eyes locked on the VIP section, waiting to see how a legend would respond to a challenge from the new generation. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Darius stood center stage, mic in hand, his chest rising and falling with the adrenaline of someone who had just thrown down a gauntlet before millions of witnesses. His followers were already hashtagging the moment. Hashtag Dragon vs. Seagal, hashtag Legend Killer, hashtag Old School vs. New. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a line he didn't fully understand. Steven Seagal sat motionless in the VIP section, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees. The arena's lights cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the lines that spoke of decades spent in dojos, on movie sets, and in the quiet spaces where true martial artists forge their souls. His eyes, dark and unreadable, remained fixed on Darius with the patient intensity of a mountain observing a passing storm. Come on, Steven, Darius called out again, his voice carrying a note of forced joviality that didn't quite mask his growing need for a response. Don't leave me hanging here. These people want to see some action. The crowd began to murmur, phones held high, live streams broadcasting the tension to millions around the world. Comments flooded social media platforms, some mocking Seagal's age, others expressing disbelief at Darius's audacity, and a growing number questioning whether the young fighter truly understood who he was challenging. Amelia Thompson leaned into her microphone, her voice carefully measured. For our viewers just joining, we're witnessing an unprecedented moment. Darius Kent, one of social media's biggest martial arts personalities, has just publicly challenged Steven Seagal to an impromptu match. The implications here go far beyond simple competition. In the VIP section, Brick's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before, young fighters seeking to make their name by challenging established legends. Usually, Seagal would simply decline with a polite smile and redirect the conversation. But something was different this time. Perhaps it was the public nature of the challenge, or the disrespectful tone, or simply the moment choosing its own destiny. "Steven," Brick said quietly, leaning slightly toward his mentor. "You don't have to do this." Seagal's response was barely audible, more felt than heard. Sometimes the lesson needs to be taught. The words sent a chill down Brick's spine. He'd heard that tone before, in dimly lit dojos decades ago, when Seagal was still competing and some overconfident challenger needed to be educated about the nature of true martial arts mastery. On the mat, Darius was beginning to pace, his movements betraying the first hints of uncertainty. The silence was stretching too long, becoming uncomfortable even for someone who lived and breathed public attention. He'd expected either an immediate decline, which he could spin as cowardice, or an eager acceptance that would play into his narrative of the old guard being hungry for relevance. This quiet consideration was something he hadn't anticipated. "I get it," Darius said, trying to fill the void. "I mean, I understand if you're not ready for this. It's been a long time since you competed for real, and I respect that. Maybe we could do a demonstration instead? Something safer, more." He searched for the word. "Appropriate?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and the crowd caught it. A few boos emerged from the older sections, while younger fans cheered their approval. The divide in the arena was becoming increasingly clear. Traditional martial artists who recognized the disrespect being shown to a living legend, and social media natives who saw this as epic content in the making. And then Steven Seagal stood up. The movement was fluid, economical, without any of the creaks or hesitations one might expect from a man his age. He rose like mist from still water, his posture straight, his presence suddenly filling the space around him in a way that made the arena feel smaller. The crowd noise died to whispers, then to perfect silence. Darius felt his mouth go dry. Standing, Seagal looked different. Not like the internet meme or the aging action star, but like something primal and dangerous that had been sleeping and had now opened its eyes. The young fighter's brain, still caught in the momentum of his challenge, struggled to process what his instincts were screaming at him. "Oh," Amelia breathed into her microphone. "He's accepting." Seagal began walking toward the arena floor, his steps measured and purposeful. Each footfall seemed to echo despite the soft carpeting, as if the building itself was acknowledging his movement. Brick followed at a respectful distance, his expression grim but resigned. He knew better than to try to talk Seagal out of a decision. Once it was made, the crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, phones steadied to capture every moment, and even the arena's background music seemed to fade to nothing. The only sounds were footsteps and the distant hum of electronic equipment. As Seagal approached the mat, Darius felt the weight of what he had unleashed. This wasn't going to be the easy viral moment he'd envisioned, a quick demonstration against an aging celebrity that would cement his reputation as the new face of martial arts. The man walking toward him moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a fight that mattered, and the younger fighter was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, some legends earned their status through more than just Hollywood magic. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice cut through the silence. "It appears we have an impromptu exhibition match. Darius, the Dragon Kent versus Steven Seagal." The words hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself. In the commentary booth, Amelia shook her head slowly. "I've covered martial arts for 15 years, she said quietly, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. Seagal reached the edge of the mat and paused, his dark eyes meeting Darius's for the first time since the challenge was issued. In that moment, the young fighter felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine uncertainty. The internet sensation, the viral star, the master of spectacular technique suddenly felt very young and very unprepared for what was about to unfold. Without ceremony, without posturing or grand gestures, Steven Seagal stepped onto the mat. The lesson was about to begin. The mat beneath their feet seemed to shrink as both fighters took their positions. Darius bounced on the balls of his feet, rolling his shoulders and loosening his neck with practiced ease. His movements were fluid and theatrical, part warm-up, part performance for the thousands of cameras pointed in his direction. He'd done this dance hundreds of times. Intimidate through display, establish dominance through spectacle, win before the first technique was thrown. Steven Seagal, by contrast, simply stood. His stance was natural, weight evenly distributed, hands relaxed. At his sides, he looked less like a fighter preparing for combat and more like a man waiting for a bus, patient, present, but fundamentally unengaged with the drama surrounding him. His breathing was steady, his gaze focused but not aggressive, and there was something in his stillness that made the arena's chaos seem suddenly trivial. "Fighters ready?" the referee asked, though he seemed almost reluctant to begin whatever this was about to become. Darius nodded eagerly, his eyes bright with the confidence of someone who had studied every YouTube video of Seagal's movie fights and found them laughably choreographed. "More than ready," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. Seagal's response was a barely perceptible inclination of his head. "Begin." Darius exploded into motion like a firecracker, launching himself forward with a spectacular combination that would have made his social media team weep with joy. A jumping spinning heel kick transitioned into a rolling thunder attack, followed by a series of flashy hand techniques that painted patterns in the air. Each movement was technically sound but amplified for visual impact. Higher kicks, wider circles, more rotation than necessary. The crowd gasped and cheered as Darius unleashed his arsenal, phones tracking his every movement. His signature Dragon Blitz was poetry in motion, a whirlwind of controlled violence that had defeated legitimate fighters and looked absolutely incredible on camera. The combination was fast, complex, and devastating to anyone who tried to match its pace. Steven Seagal moved like water. Where Darius attacked, Seagal wasn't. The older man's movements were minimal, economical, almost invisible. He didn't block so much as he wasn't where the techniques were aimed. A slight step back, a subtle shift of weight, a turn of the shoulders. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would satisfy the cameras, but devastatingly effective. Darius's spinning heel kick whistled through empty air. His rolling attack found no target. His hand combination struck nothing but space. It was as if he were fighting a ghost, or perhaps fighting his own shadow while the real opponent watched from somewhere else entirely. "Remarkable," Amelia whispered into her microphone. "Seagal is using distance and timing that's decades in the making. He's not trying to match Darius's flashy techniques. He's simply making them irrelevant." In the VIP section, a few older martial artists began to nod knowingly. They recognized what they were seeing, the difference between technique performed for effect and technique applied with understanding. Darius was demonstrating his skills. Seagal was solving problems. Growing frustrated, Darius pressed his attack. His movements became faster, more aggressive, more desperate. He threw combination after combination, each one more spectacular than the last. A flying knee transitioned into a spinning back fist. A jumping side kick flowed into a tornado technique that had him rotating through the air like a human drill bit. The crowd was on its feet, cheering the display of athleticism and skill. Phones blazed as every angle was captured, every moment documented for the viral explosion that would follow. Darius was giving them exactly what they wanted to show: a spectacle, a martial arts exhibition that would dominate social media for weeks. But he wasn't hitting anything. Seagal continued his patient dance, staying just outside the range of every technique, moving with the economy of someone who understood that the shortest distance between 2 points was rarely a straight line. His face remained calm, almost meditative, as if the whirlwind of violence around him was happening to someone else entirely. "Come on," Darius shouted, pausing his assault for a moment to gesture at his opponent. Fight back. Do something. The words echoed through the arena, carrying more frustration than challenge. For the first time since stepping onto the mat, Darius looked uncertain. His carefully crafted persona was cracking, revealing the young fighter beneath who was beginning to realize that nothing in his arsenal was working. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Seagal's response was to shift his weight slightly forward, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, but it changed everything. Suddenly, he wasn't just evading, he was present, in a way that made Darius's techniques feel not just ineffective, but somehow inappropriate, like bringing a microphone to a library. I think we're seeing the fundamental difference between performance-based martial arts and combat-tested principles, Amelia observed, her voice carrying new respect. Darius is executing techniques beautifully, but Seagal is demonstrating mastery. Brick, watching from the sidelines, allowed himself a small smile. He'd seen this before, in dojos and tournaments decades ago. Steven wasn't fighting, he was teaching. The lesson was just beginning. Darius stepped back, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. His breathing had quickened, not from exertion, but from the growing realization that his entire approach wasn't just failing, it was being made to look foolish. The Dragon Blitz, his signature combination that had defeated regional champions and thrilled millions of followers, had been rendered completely ineffective by a man who seemed to be doing nothing at all. "What are you waiting for?" Darius called out, his voice carrying an edge of desperation he tried to mask with bravado. "This is supposed to be a fight." Steven Seagal remained perfectly still for a moment, his dark eyes studying the younger fighter with something that might have been compassion. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the hushed arena. "You want to see technique?" he asked simply. It wasn't a question requiring an answer. Seagal moved. The change was instantaneous and absolute. Where before he had been passive, defensive, almost ghostly in his evasions, now he became something else entirely. He didn't rush forward or launch into the air. He simply closed the distance between them in a way that defied perception. One moment he was 3 feet away, the next he was inside Darius's guard, his right hand positioned exactly where it needed to be. The strike itself was unremarkable to untrained eyes. No spinning, no jumping, no flashy wind-ups or dramatic preparations. Seagal's fist simply traveled from his waist to Darius's solar plexus in a straight line, arriving with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the impact of a sledgehammer. Darius doubled over, the air rushing from his lungs in a sharp gasp that echoed through the suddenly silent arena. His eyes went wide, not with pain but with shock. The punch hadn't been brutal or overwhelming. It had been perfect. Every ounce of force had been transmitted exactly where it would do the most good, with timing that made his elaborate combinations look like kindergarten finger painting. He staggered backward, one hand pressed to his midsection, struggling to draw breath. The crowd had gone quiet, the collective intake of thousands of spectators creating a sound like wind through a cathedral. Phones continued to record, but the energy had shifted dramatically. "Jesus," Amelia breathed into her microphone. That was textbook. Absolutely textbook. No wasted motion, perfect timing, maximum efficiency. That's what 40 years of refinement looks like. In the commentary booth's monitors, the slow-motion replay showed the technique in devastating detail. Seagal's footwork positioning him at exactly the right angle, his body mechanics generating power from the ground up, his fist arriving precisely when Darius's own movement had left him most vulnerable. It was martial arts as physics as applied, science as art form. Darius straightened slowly, his eyes meeting Seagal's for the first time with something approaching respect. The older man hadn't moved from where he'd delivered the strike, hadn't followed up with additional attacks, hadn't celebrated or acknowledged the crowd's reaction. He simply stood there, waiting, as if the demonstration had been as natural as breathing. "How?" Darius gasped, still struggling to fully catch his breath. "Distance," Seagal replied quietly. "Timing. Understanding what you were going to do before you did it." The words carried the weight of decades, of countless hours in dojos where flash mattered less than function, where reputation was built on effectiveness rather than entertainment. Darius felt something crack inside him. Not his ribs, though they ached, but his certainty about what martial arts really meant. He launched himself forward again, but this time his attack was different. Gone were the spinning kicks and aerial displays. Instead, he threw straight punches, basic combinations, fundamental techniques that had been the foundation of his training before fame and followers had complicated everything. Seagal deflected them with movements so subtle they barely registered. A slight parry here, a minor step there, each defensive action flowing into the next like water finding its level. But now Darius could see it happening, could understand, for the first time, that his opponent wasn't just lucky or old-school tough. He was operating on a completely different level of understanding. Better, Seagal said quietly as he turned aside another combination. But you're still thinking like you're performing. The words hit harder than the punch had. Darius realized that even stripped of his flashiest techniques, he was still fighting for the cameras, still conscious of how each movement would look to his millions of followers. He was incapable of simply fighting, of existing in the moment without consideration for anything beyond the immediate exchange of technique. Seagal demonstrated this by doing something unexpected. He attacked, not with the devastating precision of his first strike, but with a series of simple, fundamental techniques that seemed to unfold in slow motion. A basic jab followed by a cross, then a hook that barely traveled 6 inches but somehow found its way through Darius's guard to tap him lightly on the temple. Each technique was elementary, the kind of combination taught in beginner classes around the world, but executed with Seagal's understanding of distance, timing, and human psychology, they became something approaching art. Darius found himself unable to respond effectively, not because the techniques were too fast or too complex, but because they were too perfect. "This is incredible," Amelia said into her microphone, her voice filled with professional awe. "Seagal is giving us a masterclass in fundamentals. He's showing that mastery isn't about the most spectacular technique. It's about understanding the most basic ones so completely that they become unstoppable." The arena had fallen into a reverent hush. Even Darius's most vocal supporters had stopped cheering, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare and valuable. This wasn't entertainment, it was education. Darius stepped back again, his chest heaving not just from physical exertion, but from the mental effort of trying to process what was happening to him. Every assumption he'd built his career on was crumbling. Every belief about what made a fighter great was being systematically dismantled by a man who moved like he was conducting a symphony rather than engaging in combat. For the first time in years, Darius felt small. Not physically. He was still young, strong, athletic, and skilled. But spiritually, philosophically, he felt like a child who had just discovered that the adults in the room knew secrets he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Seagal stood patiently in the center of the mat, his hands once again relaxed at his sides, waiting to see what lesson the young fighter was ready to learn next. Desperation crept into Darius's movements like poison through veins. The confident swagger that had carried him through countless exhibitions and viral videos was evaporating, replaced by something raw and frantic. He could feel his carefully constructed image cracking with each failed technique, each perfectly timed evasion from his opponent, each moment that passed without him landing a single meaningful strike. "This isn't over," he muttered more to himself than to Seagal, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. The arena lights felt hotter now, more oppressive, and the crowd's energy had shifted from enthusiastic cheering to something more complex, a mixture of fascination, discomfort, and growing respect for what they were witnessing. Darius centered himself on the mat, drawing upon every technique he'd ever learned, every combination he'd ever drilled, every moment of training that had brought him to this point. If his flashy attacks weren't working, if his signature moves were being neutralized, then he would unleash everything at once. Overwhelm through volume, break through Seagal's defense through sheer relentless pressure. He exploded forward with renewed fury, launching into his most complex sequence yet, the Dragon Storm, a combination he'd developed specifically for moments when everything was on the line. It began with a feinting jab that transitioned into a spinning elbow, flowed through a jumping knee strike, continued with a series of rapid-fire punches thrown from multiple angles, and culminated in a devastating spinning back kick designed to end fights. Each technique in the sequence was perfectly executed, a testament to years of dedicated training and natural athletic ability. His footwork was precise, his timing immaculate, his power generation textbook perfect. Any camera would capture it as a thing of beauty. Any highlight reel would feature it prominently, and any normal opponent would have been overwhelmed by its speed and complexity. Steven Seagal made it look like a dance performed in slow motion. The older man's movements were so economical they bordered on the supernatural. He didn't block the feinting jab. He simply wasn't where it was aimed when it arrived. The spinning elbow passed through air as Seagal shifted his weight backward by perhaps 6 inches. The jumping knee found nothing but space as its target moved, with liquid smoothness to the left. The barrage of punches struck at shadows while Seagal flowed around them like water around stones. And then, as Darius committed to his finishing spinning back kick, the technique that had ended dozens of fights, the move that had made him famous, the strike that represented everything he believed about modern martial arts, Seagal did something that redefined Darius's understanding of what was possible. He caught the kick, not with a dramatic grab or a powerful intercept, but with a simple, almost casual placement of his hands that made Darius's most devastating technique suddenly irrelevant. One hand positioned at the ankle, the other at the calf, and Darius found himself frozen in midair, his entire body weight balanced on one foot, while his other leg was held as gently and immovably as if it were trapped in quicksand. The arena fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of air conditioning. Thousands of people held their breath, witnessing something that defied their understanding of how fights were supposed to unfold. Phones continued to record, but even the most devoted social media addicts lowered their devices slightly, recognizing that they were seeing something that transcended mere entertainment. "Impossible," Darius whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the hushed space. Seagal's grip wasn't painful, wasn't aggressive, wasn't even particularly forceful. It was simply final, like trying to move a mountain or change the direction of a river. Darius pushed against it, tried to withdraw his leg, attempted to use his trapped position to launch a desperate counterattack with his free hand, but nothing worked. He was as helpless as a butterfly pinned to a board. "Your technique is excellent," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the patience of a teacher addressing a struggling student. "Your speed is impressive. Your power generation is textbook perfect." He paused, his dark eyes meeting Darius's with something that might have been kindness. "But you're fighting a ghost." "What do you mean?" Darius gasped, still struggling against the immovable grip. "You're fighting the opponent you want me to be, not the opponent I am. You're attacking where you think I should be, not where I actually am. You're responding to techniques I'm not throwing, defending against strategies I'm not using." Seagal's voice was soft, but carried clearly through the arena. "You've trained to beat a version of martial arts that exists only in your imagination." With that, he gently lowered Darius's leg to the mat and stepped back, his hands returning to their relaxed position at his sides. The release was so smooth, so natural, that it took Darius a moment to realize he was free to move again. In the commentary booth, Amelia Thompson struggled to find words adequate to what she'd just witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she finally managed, "I've been covering martial arts for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like that." Seagal just demonstrated that sometimes the most profound techniques are the simplest ones. Perfect timing, perfect distance, perfect understanding of human movement. The crowd began to murmur, a low rumble of conversation as people processed what they'd seen. Social media exploded with attempts to analyze, explain, and contextualize the moment, but the technology felt inadequate to capture its essence. How do you #enlightenment? How do you go viral with wisdom? Darius stood on unsteady legs, his entire worldview tilting on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about fighting, about martial arts, about what made someone dangerous, had just been revealed as incomplete at best and delusional at worst. He'd spent years building a reputation as one of the most skilled young fighters in the world, only to discover that skill itself might be just the beginning of a much longer journey. "I don't understand," he said, his voice small and lost. "You will," Seagal replied simply, "when you're ready." The promise hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Darius couldn't yet comprehend but could somehow feel. For the first time since stepping onto the mat, he began to suspect that winning this fight might be the worst thing that could happen to him, and losing it might be exactly what he needed. The weight of realization settled on Darius's shoulders, like a lead blanket. He stood in the center of the mat, breathing heavily, sweat dripping steadily onto the canvas beneath his feet. The arena around him seemed to pulse with a different energy now, not the electric excitement of anticipated spectacle, but something deeper and more uncomfortable. The audience had stopped cheering for tricks and started watching for truth. His millions of followers were still there, phones still recording, live streams still broadcasting his every move to the world. But for the first time in his adult life, Darius felt completely alone. The persona he'd built, the confidence he'd cultivated, the entire identity he'd constructed around being the best young fighter of his generation, all of it felt as insubstantial as smoke in a hurricane. Steven Seagal remained motionless a few feet away, his presence somehow both calming and intimidating. He wasn't gloating, wasn't posturing for the cameras, wasn't doing anything that resembled what Darius expected from a victor. He was simply present, waiting with the infinite patience of someone who understood that the most important battles happened inside the fighter, not between opponents. "I trained every day for 10 years, Darius said suddenly, his voice cracking with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Every single day? 6 hours minimum, sometimes 8 or 10. I've studied every style, mastered every technique, defeated every challenger." He looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. How is it possible that none of that matters? The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable in a way that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the cocky influencer they'd come to see. This was a young man confronting the possibility that his entire life's work had been built on a foundation of sand. "It all matters," Seagal replied quietly. "But technique without understanding is like having a library full of books in a language you can't read. The information is there, but the wisdom isn't accessible." He stepped forward slightly, his movement careful and deliberate. "You've mastered the external forms perfectly. Your body knows how to fight. But your mind is still trapped in performance mode, still thinking about how everything looks rather than what everything means." Darius felt something break inside him, not physically, but spiritually. The armor of ego and certainty that had protected him for so long cracked and fell away, leaving him exposed and trembling. He'd built his entire adult identity around being exceptional, around being better than others, around never showing weakness or uncertainty. Now, in front of thousands of witnesses and millions of viewers, he was being forced to confront the possibility that exceptional wasn't enough. "Show me," he whispered, the words barely audible, but carrying clearly in the hushed arena. Seagal nodded slowly. "Are you sure? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand the difference between fighting and performing, you'll never be able to go back to just performing." "I'm sure." The words came out stronger than Darius felt, but they carried conviction born of desperation. He needed to understand, even if that understanding destroyed everything he thought he knew about himself. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed frame by martial arts experts, and debated in forums for years to come. But no recording could capture its true essence, because what Seagal demonstrated wasn't just technique, it was philosophy made manifest. He moved toward Darius with the fluid inevitability of water flowing downhill. Not fast, not flashy, not dramatic, just purposeful. His right hand rose in what appeared to be a simple straight punch, the most basic technique in all of martial arts, something that white belts learned on their first day of training. But this wasn't a white belt technique. This was 40 years of understanding distilled into its purest form. Darius saw it coming from a mile away. He had time to prepare, time to choose his defense, time to counterattack. He threw up a textbook block, positioning his forearm exactly where every manual said it should go to intercept the incoming strike. His form was perfect, his timing precise, his execution flawless. The punch went around his block like it wasn't there. Not over it, not under it, not through it, around it, as if Seagal's fist existed in a dimension where obstacles were merely suggestions. The strike landed with surgical precision just below Darius's sternum, not with devastating force, but with perfect placement. Every ounce of energy was transmitted directly into his solar plexus, causing his diaphragm to spasm and his nervous system to temporarily forget how to process oxygen. Darius crumpled to his knees, gasping like a fish pulled from water. The strike hadn't been meant to injure or humiliate. It had been designed to teach, to show him the difference between knowing techniques and understanding combat, to demonstrate that mastery wasn't about having more tools, but about using the right tool in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. The arena erupted into chaos. Some people cheered, others gasped, and many simply sat in stunned silence. The commentators struggled to find words adequate to what they'd witnessed. Social media exploded with hot takes and analysis, but most of the commentary missed the point entirely. That wasn't about the punch, Amelia said into her microphone, her voice filled with awe. That was about seeing. Seagal didn't just throw a technique. He saw through Darius's defense to the vulnerability beneath it. He understood not just what Darius was doing, but why he was doing it, and how to make that very understanding into a weakness. On his knees, struggling to breathe, Darius felt tears mixing with the sweat on his face. Not tears of pain, the physical discomfort was already fading, but tears of recognition. For the first time in his adult life, he understood what he didn't know. The vast ocean of ignorance that he'd been sailing across while thinking he was standing on solid ground. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though whether he was apologizing to Seagal, to the audience, to his followers, or to himself wasn't clear. "Steven." Seagal knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't apologize for learning," he said quietly. "Apologize for stopping." The words hit harder than any physical strike could have. Darius realized that somewhere along the way, intoxicated by early success and social media fame, he had indeed stopped learning. He'd started believing his own hype, started thinking that technique was the same as wisdom, started confusing performance with mastery. He looked up at Seagal through blurred vision and saw not an opponent or a conqueror, but a teacher who had just given him the most valuable lesson of his life. The crowd was still there, the cameras were still rolling, his reputation was probably in ruins, and his ego lay in pieces around him. And for the first time in years, Darius felt like he might actually be on the right path. The backstage area of the Tokyo Martial Arts exhibition buzzed with controlled chaos, medics checking fighters, coaches debriefing their athletes, and social media teams frantically managing the fallout from what had just occurred on the main stage. But in a quiet corner reserved for VIP guests, Darius Kent sat alone on a folding chair, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache that had nothing to do with Seagal's strikes, and everything to do with the complete collapse of his self-perception. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages from his management team, comments from millions of followers, interview requests from major news outlets. But he couldn't bring himself to look at it. The digital world that had defined his existence for the past 5 years suddenly felt as distant and irrelevant as a half-remembered dream. "Dragon, there you are?" His manager, Kyle, burst into the quiet space like a tornado of nervous energy, tablet clutched in his manicured hands. "We need to do damage control. The videos are everywhere, but we can spin this." Emphasize that Seagal is 72 years old with 40 years more experience. Make it about respect for elders or the wisdom of traditional martial arts. Or, stop. Darius's voice was quiet, but carried enough weight to cut through Kyle's momentum. "Just stop." Kyle paused, his marketing brain struggling to process a response that didn't fit any of his predetermined categories. "But the brand. Man, your followers are confused. Some are calling you weak. Others are saying Seagal cheated somehow. We need to get ahead of this narrative before." I said stop. Darius looked up, and something in his eyes made Kyle take an involuntary step backward. "I don't want to manage the narrative. I don't want to spin anything. I just want to understand. What happened out there?" For the first time in their 3-year working relationship, Kyle was speechless. The influencer industry didn't have protocols for clients who wanted to pause the content machine for introspection. There were no hashtags for existential crisis, no filters for spiritual awakening, no engagement strategies for genuine self-reflection. I'll give you some space," Kyle finally managed, backing toward the exit. "But we really should Talk about next steps soon. The algorithm doesn't wait for anyone. When the manager was gone, silence returned to the small space like an old friend. Darius closed his eyes and allowed his mind to drift backward, past the lights and cameras and followers, past the sponsorship deals and viral videos, past the carefully constructed image of invincibility he'd spent so long building. He remembered being 12 years old, walking into Hiroshi Tanaka's traditional dojo for the first time. The space had been austere to the point of severity. White walls, polished wooden floors, no decorations except for a simple calligraphy scroll that read, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." No mirrors, no music, no distractions of any kind. Sensei Tanaka had been 63 then, a small man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to whatever lay beneath. He'd watched 12-year-old Darius attempt his first kata with the patient attention of someone who understood that every master had once been a disaster. "Why do you want to learn martial arts?" Tanaka had asked after that first awkward performance. "To be strong," young Darius had replied without hesitation. Strong how? Strong like a mountain that endures everything? Strong like water that overcomes everything? Strong like fire that transforms everything? The boy hadn't understood the question then. Hell, sitting in this backstage chair 18 years later, Darius wasn't sure he understood it now. But he remembered the feeling of knowing that there were depths to this art that he couldn't yet perceive, mysteries that would take a lifetime to unravel. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost that sense of wonder. The journey of discovery had become a destination of achievement. The quest for understanding had transformed into a hunger for recognition. The art had become a performance, the dojo had become a stage, and the sensei had become an audience to be impressed rather than a guide to be followed. When had it changed? When had he stopped asking, "What can I learn?" and started asking, "How? Will this look on camera?" When had the metrics of mastery shifted from internal growth to external validation, from personal transformation to follower count? His phone buzzed again, and this time he glanced at the screen. A text from his current. "Coach, tough break tonight, but we'll get him next time. I've got some new combinations that will blow minds on social." The message felt like it came from another universe. Get him next time? Blow minds on social? Had his coach been watching the same demonstration? Had he completely missed the point of what had just occurred? Darius thought about Seagal's words. "You're fighting a ghost. The opponent you want me to be, not the opponent I am." The insight cut deeper than any physical technique because it revealed a truth that extended far beyond the mat. He'd been living his entire adult life fighting ghosts, battling imaginary competitors, responding to fictional challenges, building defenses against threats that existed only in his own insecurity. The real Steven Seagal had been sitting quietly. In the VIP section, a 72-year-old man who'd accepted an invitation to support young athletes. The Steven Seagal that Darius had challenged existed only in his imagination, a creation built from movie clips, internet memes, and his own need to prove superiority against a symbolic representation of the old guard. How many other ghosts was he fighting? How many imaginary opponents was he wasting energy on while the real challenges, the genuine opportunities for growth, the authentic tests of character, the meaningful relationships that required vulnerability rather than invincibility, passed by unnoticed? A soft knock interrupted his reflection. "Excuse me, Mr. Kent?" He looked up to see a young girl, maybe 8 years old, holding a program from the exhibition. Her mother stood behind her, looking embarrassed but supportive. "I just wanted to say thank you," the girl said shyly. "My sensei always tells us that losing is learning and winning is just winning. I think you learned a lot tonight." The simple wisdom from a child's mouth hit him like lightning. Out of the mouths of babes, his grandmother would have said. This 8-year-old had understood in moments what he'd been struggling to grasp for hours. "You're right," he said quietly, signing her program with hands that felt steadier than they had all evening. "I did learn a lot tonight." As the girl and her mother walked away, Darius felt something shift inside him. The pain of public humiliation was still there. The embarrassment of having his limitations exposed before millions still stung. But underneath it all was something else, something that felt almost like relief. For the first time in years, he didn't have to pretend to be invincible. For the first time since becoming famous, he was free to admit that he didn't know everything. For the first time since building his brand around never losing, he could acknowledge that losing might be exactly what he needed. He pulled out his phone and, after a long moment of hesitation, began typing a message that would change everything. The message Darius posted was unlike anything his 5.2 million followers had ever seen from him. No flashy graphics, no perfectly choreographed video, no calls to action or promotional hashtags. Just words on a simple black background. Tonight, I learned that there's a difference between being skilled and being wise, between performing techniques and understanding them, between fighting for cameras and fighting for growth. I have a lot of work to do. Thank you, Steven Seagal, for the lesson. And I'm sorry for the disrespect. The post went viral within minutes, but not in the way his content usually did. Instead of shares and reaction videos, it sparked conversations. Comment threads filled with people sharing their own stories of humbling moments, of times when failure had taught them more than success ever could. Martial artists from around the world began discussing the difference between external achievement and internal development. But Darius wasn't watching the metrics. For the first time in years, he didn't care about the algorithm. He was sitting in the venue's meditation room, a space he'd never bothered to visit before, trying to understand what came next. The door opened quietly, and Steven Seagal entered. Up close, away from the lights and cameras, he looked even more like what he truly was. Not a movie star or internet meme, but a 72-year-old man who had dedicated his life to understanding the deepest aspects of martial arts. Mind if I sit? Seagal asked, gesturing to a cushion across from Darius. Please. Darius's voice was hoarse with emotion. I owe you an apology. A real one, not just a social media post. Seagal settled onto the cushion with surprising grace for his age. You don't owe me anything, but you might owe yourself something. I was so arrogant, so convinced that I knew what I was doing, that my way was better, that tradition was just outdated nostalgia. Darius shook his head. I built my entire career on being better than people like you, without ever understanding what people like you actually represented. And what do you think I represent? The question was asked without judgment, with genuine curiosity. Darius took a long moment to consider his answer. Depth, he said finally. Everything I've been doing has been surface level. Impressive to look at, effective against certain opponents, but he struggled for the words. It's like I've been living in a house and thinking I was an architect when I'd never even seen the foundation. Seagal nodded slowly. That's a good metaphor. What do you think the foundation is? I don't know. That's the problem. I thought it was technique, then I thought it was athleticism, then I thought it was innovation. But watching you tonight, feeling how easily you controlled everything that happened, I think it's something I've never even considered. It's attention, Seagal said simply. Pure, present moment attention. Not thinking about what technique to use, not worrying about how it looks, not planning 3 moves ahead. Just being completely present with what's actually happening right now. Darius felt tears threatening again. I haven't been present for anything in years. Even when I'm training, I'm thinking about filming it. Even when I'm fighting, I'm considering how it will look on highlight reels. I've been living my entire life at one step removed from my actual experience. That's not uncommon in your generation. The tools of connection have become barriers to presence. But the good news is that presence is a skill like any other. It can be developed. How? The question came out like a plea. The same way you developed your physical techniques. Practice. Daily, consistent, disciplined practice. But instead of practicing kicks and punches, you practice paying attention. Instead of building muscle memory for combinations, you build the ability to be completely present with whatever is happening. Seagal leaned forward slightly. The martial arts you've been studying are like the finger pointing at the moon. They're useful for directing attention towards something important. But if you focus only on the finger, you miss the moon entirely. What's the moon? The understanding that fighting and martial arts are just metaphors for life. That the real battle is always internal, against ego, against fear, against the illusion that you're separate from everything else. The external techniques are just ways of training the mind and spirit. Darius sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the words. Everything Seagal was saying felt both completely foreign and somehow familiar, like remembering a language he'd once known but had forgotten. I want to start over, he said quietly. Not my career, not my brand, but my understanding. I Want to learn what I should have been learning all along? Are you sure? Starting over means letting go of a lot of what you've built your identity around. It means being a beginner again, making mistakes, looking foolish sometimes. It means your follower count might drop, your sponsorships might disappear, your income might decrease. I'm sure. The certainty in his voice surprised him. Tonight proved that everything I thought I'd built was an illusion anyway. I'd rather have something real, even if it's smaller. Seagal smiled, the first genuine expression of emotion Darius had seen from him all evening. Then you're ready to begin. Where do I start? Find a teacher who cares more about your development than your achievements. Find a practice that challenges your ego rather than feeding it. Find a community that values growth over performance. He stood up, his movements smooth and unhurried. And most importantly, find the courage to be bad at something again. As Seagal reached the door, he paused. There's a small dojo in Kyoto. Traditional training, no cameras allowed, no social media presence. The sensei there was a friend of my teacher's teacher. If you're serious about starting over, I can make an introduction. Yes, Darius said without hesitation. Please, I'll send you the information. But understand, this path requires everything. Not just your time or effort, but your willingness to completely redefine what success means to you. After Seagal left, Darius remained in the meditation room for another hour, sitting in silence as the venue emptied around him. Outside, he could hear the sounds of equipment being packed away, staff cleaning up, the last stragglers making their way to the exits. His phone buzzed with notifications, but he didn't check them. For the first time in years, the digital world felt optional rather than essential. There would be time later to figure out how to manage his career transition, how to explain his decision to his team, how to navigate the practical realities of walking away from millions of dollars in potential revenue. Right now, there was only this moment, this breath, this feeling of standing at the beginning of a path he'd never noticed before, but somehow knew he was meant to walk. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, he remembered. Sensei Tanaka saying all those years ago. Tonight, finally, he was ready to take that step. 6 months after the exhibition in Tokyo, Darius Kent knelt on the worn wooden floors of the Renshinken Dojo in Kyoto, his knees aching from the unfamiliar position, sweat dripping steadily onto the ancient planks beneath him. The morning sun filtered through paper screens, casting soft shadows across walls bare of everything except a single calligraphy scroll that read Beginner's Mind. Gone was the dragon persona, the flashy gear, the constant hum of camera equipment. Here, in this traditional space that had existed for over 2 centuries, Darius wore a simple white GI with an equally simple white belt, the same rank as the 8-year-old girl practicing beside him. The humiliation of starting over had been profound at first, but gradually it had transformed into something unexpected: relief. Kenji-san, called Sensei Yamamoto, a 78-year-old master whose movements carried the fluid precision of someone who had spent 60 years refining the most basic techniques into pure art. Show me the first kata again. Darius, now, using his given name rather than his stage moniker, rose slowly and moved to the center of the practice area. The kata was elementary, something he could have performed flawlessly as a teenager. But Sensei Yamamoto wasn't interested in flawless performance. He was interested in presence, in the quality of attention Darius brought to each movement. As Darius began the sequence, his muscle memory wanted to add flourishes to make each technique more dramatic and visually impressive. But months of patient correction had taught him to resist those impulses. Instead, he focused on what Sensei Yamamoto called the small perfections: the precise angle of his wrist, the exact placement of his feet, the coordination of breath with movement. Better, the sensei said quietly when Darius finished. But your mind is still reaching toward the next technique before completing the current one. Again, there was no impatience in the instruction, no judgment. Sensei Yamamoto had the infinite patience of someone who understood that true learning happened in layers, that each repetition revealed new depths of understanding that previous repetitions had made possible. This was Darius's new reality. Endless repetition of fundamentals, microscopic adjustments to techniques he'd thought he'd mastered years ago, and the slow dismantling of everything he believed about progress and achievement. In his previous life, success was measured in followers gained, videos going viral, sponsorship deals signed. Here, success was measured in moments of perfect presence, in the gradual quieting of his ego's constant commentary, in the growing ability to simply be with whatever was happening without needing to improve it, film it, or share it with the world. The transformation hadn't been easy. His management team had fired him when he'd announced his intention to step away from social media and competitive exhibition fighting. Most of his sponsors had dropped him within weeks, unwilling to invest in an influencer who was no longer interested in influencing. His follower count had plummeted as fans moved on to other, more active content creators. The financial impact had been severe. The Tokyo apartment with its view of the city skyline had been replaced by a small room above a noodle shop near the Dojo. The designer clothing and expensive equipment had been sold to fund his extended stay in Japan. The constant stream of income from appearances, endorsements, and viral content had dwindled to nothing. But something unexpected had happened as his external life contracted. His internal life had expanded. Without the constant pressure to create content, to maintain his image, to respond to comments and criticism and praise, he'd discovered a kind of mental space he'd forgotten existed. Silence that wasn't waiting to be filled. Stillness that wasn't a pause between activities, but a destination in itself. Kinji-san. Sensei Yamamoto called after the morning's formal practice had ended, and the other students had departed for school or work. Walk with me. They strolled through the dojo's small garden, where carefully tended plants created a miniature landscape of rocks, water, and precisely placed greenery. The space was designed for contemplation, for the kind of quiet reflection that Darius was still learning to value. "You have been here 6 months," the sensei observed. "What have you learned?" It was a question Darius had been expecting, though he dreaded trying to articulate an answer. How do you describe the process of unlearning everything you thought you knew? How do you quantify the value of discovering that you've been asking the wrong questions for most of your adult life? "I've learned that I knew nothing," he said finally. "Everything I thought was mastery was just performance, like an actor playing a martial artist instead of actually being one." "Sensei," Yamamoto nodded. "And what is the difference?" "An actor performs for an audience. A martial artist practices for understanding." Darius paused, watching water drip from a bamboo fountain into a small pond. "I spent years trying to impress people with how much I knew, but I never learned how to be present with what I was actually doing." "Present," the sensei repeated. "This is the foundation that your friend Steven Seagal spoke of, yes?" The two men had maintained a correspondence over the months, brief letters that Seagal sent every few weeks. Never advice, never instruction, just observations about the weather, about small moments of beauty he'd noticed, about the way certain trees looked in different seasons. At first, Darius had been frustrated by the apparent meaninglessness of the letters. Gradually, he'd begun to understand that they were teachings disguised as casual observations, lessons in paying attention to the present moment rather than always reaching toward the future. "Yes," Darius said, "but it's harder than I thought it would be. My mind wants to make everything about improvement, about getting better, about achieving something. It doesn't want to just be. This is why we practice," Sensei Yamamoto said simply. "Not to become better fighters, but to become better humans. The fighting is just the method. The humanity is the goal." As they completed their circuit of the garden, Darius felt something settling inside him. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of rightness. For the first time since childhood, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, without any need to document it or share it or turn it into content. His phone, now a simple device, used only for communication, with all social media apps deleted, buzzed with a text message. It was from Amelia Thompson, the commentator who had covered his humbling in Tokyo. "Hope you're well. There's a traditional martial arts tournament next month in Osaka. Small event, no cameras, just practitioners. Thought you might be interested in testing what you've learned. No pressure, just an opportunity if you feel ready." Darius showed the message to Sensei Yamamoto, who read it with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "Do you feel ready?" the sensei asked. "I don't know," Darius admitted. "I don't think I'll ever feel ready the way I used to. But maybe that's the point. What would be your intention in participating?" It was the kind of question that the old Darius would have answered without thinking. To win, to prove himself, to show the world what he'd learned. But now he took time to consider what he actually wanted. To practice what I've been learning, he said slowly. To see if I can stay present under pressure. To test whether all these months of basic training have actually changed anything fundamental about how I approach conflict. Sensei Yamamoto smiled. Those are good intentions. If you can maintain them, if you can compete without needing to win, if you can fight without needing to dominate, if you can lose without feeling diminished, then you might be ready to return to the world. That evening, as Darius knelt in meditation before the dojo's simple altar, he felt the weight of decision settling around him. 6 months ago, he would have leaped at any opportunity to return to competition to prove that his setback had been temporary, to reclaim his place in the martial arts world. Now, the prospect felt both terrifying and necessary. Not as a return to his old life, but as a test of his new understanding. A chance to see if the lessons learned in this quiet dojo could survive the pressure of public scrutiny and competitive challenge. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine stepping onto a mat again. But this time, the image was different. No cameras, no commentary, no social media buzz. Just two practitioners sharing their understanding of an ancient art, each trying to remain present with whatever unfolded between them. It felt like coming home to a place he'd never been before. The traditional martial arts tournament in Osaka was everything that Darius's former world was not. Held in a community center gymnasium with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs, it attracted perhaps 200 spectators, mostly family members of competitors and serious practitioners, who valued substance over spectacle. There were no professional photographers, no live streams, no hashtag campaigns. Just the quiet intensity of people who practiced martial arts for the art itself rather than for any external reward. Darius sat in Seiza on a thin mat at the edge of the competition area, watching the earlier matches with the attention Sensei Yamamoto had taught him to bring to everything. 6 months ago, he would have been analyzing opponents, looking for weaknesses to exploit, planning strategies for maximum visual impact. Now, he simply observed the way each fighter moved, the quality of their presence, the respect they showed for their art and their opponents. He wore the same simple white gi he'd trained in every day for the past months, with the addition of a brown belt that Sensei Yamamoto had awarded him the week before. Not for technical mastery, his techniques were still being refined daily, but for what the sensei called maturity of spirit. The understanding that martial arts was a conversation rather than a monologue, a dance rather than a demolition. Kenji Darius. His name was called by an elderly tournament official who read from a handwritten bracket. The formal announcement of his bout caused no stir in the small crowd. These people had no idea who he'd been in his previous life, no awareness of his millions of former followers or his viral videos. Here, he was simply another brown belt preparing to test his understanding against a peer. His opponent was introduced as Takashi Watanabe, a stocky man in his 30s who taught karate at a traditional dojo in Nara. As they bowed to each other before the match, Darius saw something in Takashi's eyes that he recognized from his own reflection in recent months, the calm intensity of someone who practiced not for glory, but for understanding. The referee's signal to begin was almost anticlimactic after the elaborate productions Darius had grown accustomed to. No music, no announcer building drama, no camera operators circling for the perfect angle. Just two men stepping into the space between them, each carrying their art like a prayer. Takashi moved forward with measured confidence, throwing a straight punch that was technically perfect and strategically sound. 6 months ago, Darius would have countered with something flashy, a spinning technique or aerial maneuver designed to impress. Instead, he simply stepped to the side and redirected the energy with a basic Tai Sabaki movement that Sensei Yamamoto had made him practice 10,000 times. The counter felt effortless, not because it was easy but because it was appropriate, like finding exactly the right word in a conversation or hitting a musical note that resonated perfectly with the surrounding harmony. Takashi's momentum carried him past Darius's new position, and a gentle push at the precise moment of maximum imbalance sent him stumbling toward the edge of the competition area. But Darius didn't follow up with an aggressive attack. Instead, he waited, allowing Takashi to regain his balance and composure. This wasn't about domination or demonstration. It was about the quality of engagement, the presence he could bring to each moment of interaction. Interesting, Takashi said quietly, as they reset to the center. You fight like you're listening. The observation surprised Darius with its accuracy. That was exactly what he was doing. Listening not just with his ears, but with his entire body, his whole attention, to the conversation that unfolded between them through movement and technique. Fighting as dialogue rather than monologue, as Sensei Yamamoto had taught him. They engaged again, and this time Takashi's approach was more cautious, more respectful of what he'd encountered. Their exchange became a kind of physical poetry, techniques flowing into counter-techniques, each man responding to what the other offered, neither trying to impose a predetermined script on their interaction. Darius found himself completely present in a way he'd never experienced during competition. No part of his mind was thinking about how this would look to observers. No energy was being diverted toward managing his image or planning his post-match content. There was only this moment, this breath, this step, this technique emerging naturally from the space between him and his opponent. In the small crowd, unnoticed by the competitors, Steven Seagal sat quietly in the back row. He'd driven down from Tokyo after receiving a letter from Sensei Yamamoto describing Darius's progress. Now, watching the young man he'd humbled 6 months ago, he saw the transformation that authentic training could accomplish. The flashy techniques were gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, genuine presence and understanding. The match continued for several minutes, neither man dominating, each responding to what the other offered. It became clear to experienced observers that both fighters were testing not just physical techniques, but psychological and spiritual principles. How long could they maintain presence under pressure? How completely could they let go of the need to win in favor of the opportunity to learn? Finally, as Takashi committed to a complex combination attack, Darius saw an opening, not for a spectacular counter, but for a simple, clean technique that would end the match efficiently. A basic hip throw, executed with perfect timing and minimal force, that used Takashi's own momentum to bring him gently to the ground. As Takashi fell, Darius could have followed up with a dominant ground position or submission attempt. Instead, he offered his hand to help his opponent stand, bowing deeply to acknowledge the quality of their exchange. Yame, the referee called the end of the match, awarding the victory to Darius. But there was no celebration, no victory pose, no playing to any cameras. Just two martial artists bowing to each other with genuine respect, having shared something valuable regardless of who the official records would declare the winner. After the tournament, as competitors and spectators began to disperse, Steven Seagal approached Darius near the entrance. That was beautiful, Seagal said simply. Thank you. Darius bowed, then met the older man's eyes with a directness that hadn't been possible 6 months ago. And thank you for the lesson in Tokyo. I understand now that you weren't trying to beat me. You were trying to wake me up. Are you awake now? Darius considered the question seriously. More awake than I was. But I think this is the kind of sleep you keep waking up from, over and over again. The work doesn't end. No, Seagal agreed. It doesn't. But that's what makes it worthwhile. As they walked together toward the parking area, Seagal handed Darius a simple business card. There's a dojo in Los Angeles where some of us train quietly. No cameras, no social media, just practice. If you ever decide to return to the States, you'd be welcome. Darius pocketed the card without looking at it. The future felt less urgent now, less demanding of immediate decisions and strategic planning. There would be time to consider next steps, to figure out how to integrate what he'd learned with the practical realities of life in the modern world. For now, there was just this moment, standing in a parking lot in Osaka, having just completed a tournament that no one would write articles about, that would generate no viral content, that would add nothing to his public profile, but had somehow added everything to his understanding of what it meant to be a martial artist. The dragon was dead. In its place stood something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. A human being who had learned to be present with whatever life offered, who could engage fully without needing to dominate, who could practice. An ancient art not for fame or recognition, but for the simple joy of continued awakening. As he walked back toward his car, Darius felt the weight of the brown belt around his waist, not as a symbol of rank or achievement, but as a reminder of how much he still had to learn. The journey of 1,000 miles, he thought, remembering Sensei Tanaka's words from so many years ago. He was finally ready to take the second step. End of story. Author's note. This story explores the tension between performance and practice, between external validation and internal development, and between martial arts as entertainment and martial arts as a path of personal transformation. Through Darius's journey from arrogant influencer to humble student, we see that true mastery lies not in dominating others, but in understanding oneself, not in perfect technique, but in perfect presence, and not in never losing, but in learning how to lose without being diminished by the experience. The character of Steven Seagal represents the wisdom that comes from decades of authentic practice, the understanding that the greatest victories are often invisible to external observers, and that the most profound teachings happen not through words, but through direct experience. His patient dismantling of Darius's ego was not cruelty, but compassion, not destruction, but reconstruction. In the end, Darius's transformation from dragon to simply himself represents the universal journey from ego to authenticity, from performance to presence, from the need to prove ourselves to others to the willingness to discover who we truly are beneath all our carefully constructed identities. The martial arts become a metaphor for life itself, a practice of showing up fully to whatever arises, meeting challenges with presence rather than force, and finding in each moment an opportunity for deeper understanding rather than another chance for validation. This is the true meaning of mastery, not the accumulation of techniques or victories, but the cultivation of awareness, humility, and the courage to remain open to learning regardless of how much we think we already know. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.